After astronauts returned from outer space, scans of their bodies showed a concerning phenomenon. After 6 months spent orbiting the Earth, a team of astronauts returned to terra firma from their temporary home in space. But as the doctors examine the results of their tests, they realize that something is wrong. Although the astronauts appear fine on the surface, their bodies have changed in a disturbing way. Astronauts naturally go through many changes while away from our planet. And, over time, their bodies begin to adjust to the alien conditions of space. But that's not what's of concern here. It's something else, something truly alarming. It could even affect the future of long-distance space flight. A research team in Ottawa, Canada, noticed this when they explored exactly what happens to the human body in orbit. They were studying astronauts before and after they headed to the stars. And when they looked at breath samples from more than a dozen subjects, they spotted a strange phenomenon. It turns out that some changes were sticking around long after these men and women had returned to Earth. Ever since the first living beings went into space, there have been questions about the impact of space travel on terrestrial biology. That's partly why early flight sent animals, rather than humans, into the stratosphere. These creatures, from Laika the dog to a monkey called Gordo, essentially served as test subjects to lay the groundwork for future missions. But that doesn't mean all of the kinks were ironed out by the time Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to leave our planet. Even now, experts are still learning about how space travel affects our bodies. And while we have the answers to many of the most intriguing questions, we still haven't solved some crucial ones. What, for example, would happen if an astronaut found themselves stuck outside their ship or station without the proper equipment? For years, many have assumed that person would simply freeze to death. But in truth, matter is needed to both create and transfer heat. The only way to alter the temperature of a human body in the vacuum of space is through radiation, a somewhat ineffective energy exchange. That means a stranded astronaut would lose their body heat very gradually. It's hardly the instant death freeze many expect. In fact, it's technically possible for a human to survive unprotected for several hours in space before succumbing to the cold. But temperature isn't the only thing to consider. Would-be astronauts should be far more worried about the lack of atmospheric conditions away from their home planet. You see, on Earth our bodies are used to a certain level of air pressure. When we travel into space, then, we need special suits to recreate these conditions. And if an astronaut were ever to find themselves exposed in a vacuum, they would be instantly at risk of a number of terrifying health issues. Instant decompression would cause any air in an astronaut's lungs to expand. That would probably cause fatal injuries. The unlucky astronaut may not feel this, though, as the lack of oxygen in space would quickly render them unconscious. And according to some rather grim experiments, a living organism cannot survive in such a state for long. But outside of space-based horror movies, the chances of an astronaut finding themselves stranded without a spacesuit are slim. Of much more concern are the long-term effects of off-world travel. As it turns out, spending time in microgravity can wreak havoc on the human body. You'd be forgiven for assuming that astronauts come back from space in much the same shape as they went up. After all, human missions to space have drastically increased in duration, from less than 2 hours in Gagarin's case to the current record-breaking total of 437 days. But as mankind spends longer and longer away from Earth, a number of physical challenges have begun to make themselves known. So, what exactly is going on? Well, because our bodies are best adapted to conditions on Earth, microgravity affects them in all manner of strange ways. Take, for example, our cardiovascular system. In terrestrial conditions, this battles against gravity to ensure that blood is evenly spread throughout our extremities. In space, on the other hand, this system soon malfunctions. Without gravity, blood rushes from the legs almost instantly, pooling towards the top of the body and making an astronaut look bloated in the face. And while things eventually return to normal, astronauts have reported related symptoms that have continued for days. Some even experience blackouts or heart issues long after their return to Earth. It's this that has left many experts concerned. A career as an astronaut seems a little less appealing when it comes with a number of long-term health conditions attached. And what of any future space colonists? They'll have to embark on a long journey before settling on a new planet, and so we need to know how the trip will affect them physically. But it's not just our blood that does strange things in space. Apparently, the lack of gravity can cause muscle atrophy. In fact, studies suggest that some astronauts can lose as much as half of their muscle mass during a single mission. As with the circulatory issues, these muscle problems may continue back on Earth. Even worse, the bones can be affected. The body gets rid of more calcium in space than it does on terra firma, and this leaves an astronaut in danger of bone fractures. That's not all. Microgravity can also affect the body's sensory systems, leaving some former space travelers struggling with dizziness back on Earth. Then there's the fact that astronauts are also exposed to high levels of radiation, which could lead to changes to DNA, cataracts, cancer, and more. In other words, space is not a particularly healthy place to be.
And
But as
in the
agencies such
slope,
as
of
NASA
course,
plan ever more
the
ambitious journeys to the
various edges
stars,
of
the
the
need to
footprint
understand these
might go on
risks
up
is
to 6
growing
or
greater
7
every
inches,
year. And as studies continue to
compacting this
monitor the effects
material
of
would
long-term
tend
space
to
travel, it seems likely that
produce a
we'll
slight
uncover even more
sideways
health
motion as
risks.
it was compacted
Scientists
on
at
the
the
material
University of
underneath it.
Ottawa and the Ottawa Hospital certainly appeared to find something ominous. As part of their study published in the journal Nature Medicine in January 2022, the Canadian team took samples of both blood and breath from 14 astronauts before their 6-month stints in space. But the research didn't end there. While on board the International Space Station (ISS), the subjects continued with the tests and sent the results back to Earth. Then, on their return, all but one of the astronauts submitted additional samples for the study. And for as long as 12 months after the end of the space missions, the research continued. It built up a picture of how the astronauts' bodies had changed and how those changes had lasted. The results were surprising. The team analyzed the breath samples taken from the astronauts at each stage of the mission. And by looking at the levels of carbon dioxide within, they were able to track the presence of red blood cells in the subjects. Or, more accurately, the lack of red blood cells. You see, for every carbon monoxide molecule the body produces, it gets rid of a corresponding molecule of heme, a key component of red blood cells. And the results all pointed to one worrying conclusion. In space, it seems, these essential biological agents were being depleted at an alarming rate. On Earth, we rely on our red blood cells to distribute oxygen throughout our bodies. And if they become depleted, that can make us anemic. Typically, anemia makes you feel lethargic and frail, hardly conducive to a demanding life in space. The effects of what has been dubbed space anemia may not be so much of an issue in orbit. But when astronauts return to Earth, the real challenges soon become apparent. In a January 2022 statement from the Ottawa Hospital, Dr. Guy Triddle explained why a reduction in red blood cells should still cause concern. Thankfully, having fewer red blood cells in space isn't a problem when your body is weightless, Triddle said. But when landing on Earth and potentially on other planets or moons, anemia affecting your energy, endurance, and strength can threaten mission objectives. The effects of anemia are only felt once you land and must deal with gravity again. Even if the astronauts didn't feel too bad, there was something serious going on behind the scenes. The study found that the participants were losing considerably more red blood cells in space compared to on Earth, the equivalent of 3 million cells per second. By comparison, the human body typically loses around 2 million red blood cells in the same timeframe under normal conditions. Experts believe that the only reason the astronauts didn't succumb to severe anemia during their missions is because their bodies produced extra red blood cells to compensate. But back on Earth, things soon took a turn for the worse. According to the study, nearly half of the participants were found to be clinically anemic when tested soon after their return. Thankfully, the condition appears to be reversible, although the astronauts did not recover as quickly as you may imagine. After their return to Earth, the astronauts continued to submit samples to Triddle's team. Fortunately, within a few months, their red blood cell numbers were seen climbing back up to regular levels. Yet even then, the cell numbers were a long way off what they had been before the mission. And an entire year later, the effects of space anemia were still being felt. According to the study, samples taken from the astronauts 12 months after their return showed red blood cells were still being lost at an increased rate. Moving forwards, this discovery could have far-reaching implications for the future of space travel. And while experts had been aware of this troublesome condition before Triddle and his team's study, they didn't realize just how serious it could be. In the official statement, Triddle explained, space anemia has consistently been reported when astronauts return to Earth since the first space missions, but we didn't know why. Our study shows that upon arriving in space, more red blood cells are destroyed, and this continues for the entire duration of the astronauts' mission, Triddle added. Previously, adaptations to microgravity were believed to be the cause of this mysterious anemia. After all, we know that these shifts can reduce the fluids in blood vessels by as much as 10%. And after the astronauts had returned from space, it was believed this anemia would subside. Now, though, Triddle and his colleagues' work has revealed that this condition is a direct result of prolonged exposure to microgravity, not just a temporary blip. So what does this mean in a world that wants astronauts to spend more, not less, time in space? Well, according to the official statement on the results of the study, this all highlights the importance of efficient health checks before missions. If, for example, a person shows signs of any blood conditions, they could be particularly susceptible to space anemia. Secondly, the study suggests astronauts adapt their diets in order to cope with the physical challenges of space. On Earth, iron-rich foods such as leafy green vegetables and red meat can both help to ease the symptoms of anemia. On the ISS, though, fresh produce is not easy to come by. Basically, space agencies such as NASA may need to go back to the drawing board. But even with screenings and diet adaptations in place, space anemia still poses a worrying threat. Back in 2020, Trudel and his team published the result of another study, one that found the condition worsens the longer astronauts spend away from Earth. And with Mars missions predicted to take around 7 months each way, their participants' health could be severely affected. What's more, experts remain in the dark as to how long the human body can sustain such dramatic changes in red blood cell count. In other words, we have no idea how space anemia may affect astronauts spending several years on another planet. Before we can extend our reach into the stars, then, we need to learn more about the impact of such conditions. In the meantime, the study could have positive ramifications back on Earth. At the Ottawa hospital, Trudel works with patients who have developed anemia after long periods of reduced activity. As with the astronauts in the study, they experience a loss of red blood cells, although no one really knows why. Are these bedridden individuals suffering from something similar to what humans experience in space? And if so, what happens next? In the statement, Trudel explained, if we can find out exactly what's causing this anemia, then there is potential to treat it both for astronauts and for patients here on Earth.